Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Flourish FM, a podcast for the good life. Our guest today is Dr. Zach Mercurio. Zach is a researcher, author, and speaker specializing in purposeful leadership, mattering, meaningful work, and positive organizational psychology. As author of The Invisible Leader, Zach has inspired individuals and organizations to discover and leverage their unique purpose to drive engagement and success. He's also a leading expert on workplace culture, helping leaders cultivate environments where people feel valued and motivated. His research has received awards from the Association for Talent Development, the Academy of Management, and the Academy of Human Resource Development. His work's featured in major media outlets like Forbes, Psychology Today, and Harvard Business Review. And his next book is The Power of Mattering, which is coming out in May 2025, which reveals how experiencing mattering to other people is a fundamental yet often overlooked requirement for thriving. And that is the focus of our conversation today. Nick, what did you most enjoy about our conversation with Zach?
Well, that right there, right? The specific emphasis on a term that you and I were familiar with, but really hasn't come up a lot in now almost 60 episodes of the show, which is mattering. But then I think the secondary highlight for me was that he was able to weave the interesting science of mattering with things that come up in a ton of our episodes. Purpose, meaning, social connection, loneliness, burnout, thriving, flourishing, all the different things, right? So it was this really, I thought, kind of nice combination of some new and emerging science, some interesting ideas that can be wildly helpful to people with a lot of things we've talked about. And then he had a great way of kind of bundling it all together and turning it into practical action steps that are extremely easy, I think, for people to start executing on. So really, really great conversation. You know, I've been a big fan of his for a while. I know you are now after consuming some of his stuff, and the conversation didn't disappoint.
Absolutely. It's a great conversation. We hope you will enjoy it as well. This is How to Harness Meaning, Mattering, and Purpose for a Flourishing Work Life with Dr. Zach Mercurio. Zach, welcome. How you doing?
I'm doing really well. Thanks, John. Really appreciate being here with you and Nick.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Flourish FM. And let's start by diving into your forthcoming book, The Power of Mattering, How Leaders Can Create a Culture of Significance, which is coming out May 2025 with Harvard Business Review Press. And that connects with some of your earlier work, which we'll dive into later as well. This book shows how our experience of mattering to other people is a fundamental yet often overlooked requirement for thriving. So let's kick things off with this question. Why is mattering to others so important for thriving?
When my first son was born, so I have a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old, two boys. And when my first son was born, I remember I was in the hospital and, they put them on the bassinet and I saw him there. And when I went to greet him, I remember very vividly the first thing that he did was he tilted his head up to look at me. And then he reached out his little hand and he grasped onto my index finger very tightly.
Oh, wow.
And it was an amazing moment. I wish I had known what I know now from studying mattering, that I was experiencing about 6 million years of fine-tuned programming that programs us from the moment we open our eyes with a couple of reflexes to search to matter to someone else. We search to matter to another human being before we search for food. There was a great book called The Earliest Relationship by T. Berry Brazelton. It's called The Drama of Early Attachment. And she talks about that grip I felt was called the grasp reflex. Now, you did that, I did that, we all did that. We tilted our head upward, we reached out, we grasped to be significant to someone else before we searched for food. In fact, you, Nick, myself, we would not be on this call alive right now if at some point in our lives we did not procure mattering to someone else enough so they would keep us alive. Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, a philosopher at NYU, calls this our mattering instinct. So it is not only a requirement for human thriving, it's the first thing we do. It is an instinct, it's survival instinct.
Can we spotlight and double click on that? I'm sorry to cut you off, but I actually think that's a really, really important piece, because anytime I talk about something like So you hear the term negativity bias a lot, right? And when you explain something like that, you go back to human beings' most fundamental need, right? Do you leave the cave or not? Because the most fundamental need, I would tell people, and you're now, I think, telling me something else. I'm curious to learn more, hear more. The most fundamental need is survival. Do I stay in the cave or do I go find food? And what you're telling me is there's something that's more primary than that. And I think that's worth hearing again.
Complementary to that, because
Mm,
our survival depends on mattering to someone enough to keep us alive.
Mm.
Uh, when we're in community with each other, our survival depends on mattering enough to community members to keep us alive. It's how we've evolved. Uh, Mattering comes first. The search for
mm,
mattering comes first. It evolves into, as we move into adulthood, the fundamental need to feel seen, heard, valued, and needed. It's present in every culture, every occupation, every generation has the same instinct for significance. And that's why when you see things like self-determination theory, for example,
right.
theories of motivation, and it is
We
almost
just had
impossible.
Dan Pink on, just
Oh, great.
literally two
Well,
episodes ago.
he was great because he added purpose,
Yes. Yep.
to
We're going to
relatedness,
go there.
autonomy, mastery, purpose,
Yep.
right? Purpose is the belief that I, in some way, add value,
Yep.
that I have some reason for being. Well, in order to feel like I add value or I contribute, for example, I first have to believe I'm worthy of contributing. I have to believe that I matter, that my life matters. In order for us to do anything today, to get up, open our eyes, get dressed, eat, use our unrelenting energy to keep our lives going, we have to believe at some small, very cellular level that we in our lives are significant and that we
Mm.
matter.
Mhm.
And so mattering turns into this fundamental human need. Now, in children, child psychology, we call this attachment theory, right? So when a child has secure attachment, really what secure attachment is feeling seen, safe, and supported by an adult. It's almost mattering in disguise. A lot of these modern psychological terms are mattering in disguise. So that's feeling seen, safe, and supported by an adult so that the child, when they have that secure base, can go out, they can experiment, they can build relationships, they can screw up, and then they can come back because they know someone supports them. Now, we don't like using this in the workplace, but I study work. So the same is true with things like psychological safety. And I know you've had Dr. Edmondson on.
We've had Amy on. Yep.
Psychological safety is again a little bit of mattering in disguise because it's having its secure
Yes.
attachment at work. So if I feel
Mhm.
safe, seen, and supported by a boss or a coworker, I can venture out, innovate, engage, create because I know someone has my back. True confidence is the result of knowing someone has my back. And knowing I'm seen, safe, and supported. And so those things, those relationships are so fundamental to motivation, to resilience, social support, to um, innovation in organizations, to learning. But I believe a lot of these concepts are actually talking about this fundamental need to feel seen, heard, valued, and significant to others. Um, and a lot of these topics, I think, are mattering in disguise. And that's why mattering, I think, comes first, right? You can't discover your purpose or your contribution if you don't first believe you're worthy of contributing. You
Mhm.
can't use your strengths, right? With strengths-based work, can you use your strengths if you don't first believe you have strengths?
Mhm.
Can you share your voice if you don't first believe your voice is significant? So I think when we talk about why mattering is fundamental for thriving, it's really because mattering is a survival instinct. It's a fundamental need. It's a universal longing, and it's woven into a lot of the psychological concepts we see.
So and I was kind of searching here. I didn't get an immediate answer. Do you and Scott Barry Kaufman know each other? Have you been on the psychology podcast?
I haven't yet.
You should be. And it's so my second question is, have you read his book, Transcend?
No, but it's right there, and I know
Oh,
what
it is. Oh, that's
it's right
funny.
behind
Okay.
us, and
All
it's
right.
on the list because he reimagines Maslow, which I think is an important thing.
100%. And that's what I wanted to point to because the boat, if you will, and his sailboat metaphor and kind of these three levels involves some level of like self-esteem, I think, or self-concept or self-efficacy first. And then purpose is higher up as part of the sale, that like once you kind of have the kind of the confidence, the structure to then open your sale, so to speak, yada, yada, yada. That sounds a lot like what you're
Yeah.
describing.
Isn't this fun, guys? Like when these
Yeah.
things, when you see the evolution of our understanding of what it means to be human coming from all different sources, I love that. And it's because I think the time for these ideas have come. There are two beliefs that are required for all human behavior, whether it's at work or in our lives. We have to believe that we're worthy and we have to believe that we're capable. Self-esteem and self-efficacy. One of the problems, though, that's been missing with our self-actualization obsession is that I can't just go believe that I'm worthy by myself. I can't just go believe that I'm capable without being in an environment that shows me the real evidence that I'm worthy and the evidence that I'm capable. And this is what's powerful about my work with leaders, right? Leaders can architect environments where people see the evidence of their significance so that it can strengthen their belief that both they're worthy and that they're capable. One of the reasons why we've gotten to this place where all of a sudden people are talking about mattering is because we've spent the last 20 years helping people to actualize themselves. Well, Scott Barry Kaufman and others have realized that the pathway up and through Maslow's pyramid to self-actualization ironically relies on others. Every one of them. We don't go cultivate our own belonging. We don't go cultivate our own safety. We don't go create structures and systems that provide us food and shelter. Self-actualization actually relies on others. And Maslow critiqued his own theory in a critique of self-actualization theory, a great paper that nobody talks about because it's more nuanced. But he says that we rely on others. And so what's really powerful about the mattering concept is that it's so foundational, but it's also reliant largely on how we treat one another, what we reflect back to one another. You mentioned self-concept. Self-concept is built through reflected appraisals, signals we get from other that
Mm,
add
mm.
little, they add little pieces of evidence to our well of self-belief, our reservoir of self-belief that we can dip back into when things get hard and when we need to get motivated. So mattering is closely related to self-concept, and it's a property of a self-concept that says, I believe that I matter. And people who believe that they matter tend to act like they matter.
Hmm.
John the philosopher would maybe appreciate this reference, but I used to teach a class where we'd study, excuse me, kind of a Aristotelian narrative sense of self, right? And
Mm,
basically the argument is you cannot understand yourself, right, removed from context, from other people and those relationships and that identity. And that's what sort of like rang through some of what you were sharing there, right? And it
yeah.
also it leads me to think Mark Schultz comes up. We've had Mark on The Good Life, right?
Hmm.
And the takeaway, like other people matter,
Hmm.
right? Now we're talking about mattering. We're talking about purpose, but a term we not, haven't necessarily mentioned that keeps coming into my head and related to Mark and others' work is meaning, right? And the extent to which we often access meaning through other people, but that's still a little different than maybe purpose and a little different than mattering, certainly as the literature is concerned, right? So would you kind of walk
Mm.
us through the distinction between those three things to help create a foundation before we move forward?
Yeah. And do you mind if I move backward just a little bit? Because you
Yeah,
mentioned
please.
something that's
Yeah.
important.
Yeah,
You mentioned like
100%.
some other people are starting to talk about these ideas of self-concept and how we're interdependent. We've always been interdependent. Interdependence
Sure.
doesn't sell books, unfortunately, right? The self-help, actualize yourself, do all these things to actualize yourself, that sells. And but there's no committee in your head that says, okay, now you're actualized, go help one another. It's like the old adage of put your oxygen mask on first. Well, it takes about a
Right.
second to put your oxygen mask on, and then you're ready to go help someone else. The problem is that we've created a society of people so obsessed with actualizing themselves that that the skills to help others actualize, like through creating mattering, through seeing, hearing, valuing, and understanding others, have actually withered as a result of us not using them over the past several years. So there's phrases like you are enough, right? Or believe in yourself. Those are really helpful, I think. There's nothing wrong with them, but we are not enough on our own psychologically from a flourishing standpoint,
Right.
Mhm.
right? We're not enough on our own. Individuals' well-being is a community endeavor. So the mission that I'm on is to help people start thinking about what are the essential skills we need to help others actualize themselves so we all become better. But I think it's just a key point that you mentioned that, there's some books about this now, some talk about this now. And I think it's because we're seeing through presenting symptoms like loneliness and disengagement
Hmm.
that is perpetually unchanged. We're actually seeing presenting symptoms of a lack of the social infrastructure to ensure people feel valued and know how they add value.
Hmm.
That's happened over the last 20 years. Um, but let's go back to your question, which is what's the difference? So, there's a lot of terms out there. And one of the things,
Sure.
psychology especially is just concept obsessed. We turn everything into a concept, which we've done Isaac, Prilatensky, Gordon Flatt, we've done that with mattering. But there's a difference, and understanding the etymology of the meaning of words is important. So let's start with meaning, right? Meaning is the sense we make of anything. So we're making meaning right now. If I were walking along the shore and I saw a seashell, I pick it up and I say, that's a seashell because I'm sensing that it's a seashell. I've made meaning of that thing as a seashell. But there's a difference between meaning and meaningfulness and meaninglessness. So I'm going to add a couple layers here. Meaningfulness is when I say, oh gosh, this seashell reminds me of a vacation I went on with Nick. And, so now all of a sudden that meaning becomes significant.
Mhm.
That's meaningful. Or if meaninglessness or it's just a seashell, I throw it aside. Has no emotional anchor for me. It's not significant in any way. That becomes a meaningless experience. Meaninglessness. Okay. So meaning is the sense we make of something. Meaningful is when that sense is positive, purposeful, significant. Meaningless is the opposite polarity of that. When we talk about meaningful work, for example, we're talking about the global experience of experiencing my work as positive, purposeful, and significant. Purpose is the reason for which something exists, something that's directed and useful to other people, right? So it's our reason for being. The crux of why purpose works is transcendence. It focuses us on our behavior, on a person or a time outside of myself. So who are you going to be 5 years from now? What are you going to do for others? Your contribution. And that's what pulls us forward. Purpose is one input that helps us see how we're adding value. But mattering is the experience of feeling significant to the people around us. Right? So
Like
when we have a
they
sense
see
of
the value.
purpose, yeah, when we have a sense of purpose, that's one input that helps us feel like we matter. And I would argue that mattering helps us develop a sense of purpose, but it's one input. Meaning or meaningfulness is more of a global sense of the experience we have with something. Mattering is a key input to meaningfulness because, for example, how am I supposed to experience something as positive, purposeful, and significant if I don't believe that I'm positive, purposeful, and significant as a contributor?
Mhm.
Sure.
Mhm.
So those are the
And
differences. And I would add that I had a revelation in 2019, 2020 into the pandemic that I had been doing research on meaningful work and I had been doing work on purpose. And I had this realization after reading some of psychologist Gordon Flett's work on the experience of mattering that it would be very difficult for someone to find their purpose or see their purpose if they first didn't believe they were worthy of that purpose. If they first didn't feel valued, it would be very difficult for someone to add value, just like a child. If they don't feel a secure attachment, it's very difficult for them to go out and feel safe coming back. And so I consider my next book the prequel to my other book, like if there's prequels in nonfiction.
Hmm.
That mattering, the original title of the book was actually Mattering Comes First, but people didn't think anybody knew what mattering was. So it's The Power of Mattering, which I like better now, but really mattering comes first. Does that help? Does that
yeah, no,
clarify?
that
Like,
that
let's dig
that
into that.
definitely helps. And I mean, one follow up to that is if we think about the biggest sense of meaningfulness, feeling that your life is meaningful. Actually, that's not the biggest sense of meaningful, I guess, because the biggest sense means what is the meaning of life. But let's put that on hold for a moment. Feeling your own life is meaningful. Presumably, mattering is a necessary condition for finding your life meaningful. That is to say, if you don't think you matter at all, there's a risk that you wouldn't find your life meaningful at all.
And I don't want to come on here and say authoritarian, I'm the authority on this. Yes, it's my opinion based on what I've read up to this point.
Right.
The evidence seems to show that if we don't feel like we in our lives are worthy, if we don't feel like we're capable, if we don't feel like we matter, then human energy will be in short supply. Right? It's almost from like an evolutionary. There's evolutionary psychologists that have thrown around this idea that the belief that we matter is somehow etched into our very genes to continue life. Like the organism has to matter enough to give itself energy.
So how do they reach that conclusion? What studies have
It's
they
just
done?
evolutionary psychologists and philosophers.
Right.
And there's a great article, read. It's called "The Mattering Instinct." It's by
Right.
Rebecca Newberger Goldstein again, that gets into some of the evolutionary perspective. But this idea that expending energy for no reason is not really a natural law.
Right. So be expending energy because of the role you play in your community or to serve other people in your community, for example, right?
Right. Or to continue on, to know that your existence in some way matters. I mean, if you think about just from personally, think about the power of the feeling of knowing that your presence and your absence matters to just one other person. There are a few more powerful driving forces of continuing on when you look at Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, the will to meaning, the knowing we matter to someone else outside of ourselves.
Yeah.
In workplace, it's just the inverse of burnout or a major indicator of burnout, right? Like, and when people talk about burnout, we'll often say like motivations or projection. I expend this energy, I get this thing. So if I'm expending this energy and not getting this thing, the body better shut it down at some point. That's crazy.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when you feel like you don't matter, when you feel like you're insignificant, two behaviors tend to result. We see it in our interview research, but we also see it in research in other fields, like on learned helplessness from Marty Seligman.
Sure.
Is that when we feel insignificant, two things happen. We either act in withdrawal or we act out in desperation. So quiet quitting, for example, was a trend that came about by a TikTok influencer that said, "Hey, if you don't like your job, just do the bare minimum and get by." It's what everybody's doing. Now, the virality of that should raise our antennae and say there is an anti-mattering epidemic, because when people feel insignificant, they will withdraw into learned helplessness. When people have been conditioned by their environment or the people around them or systems to believe that they can't, won't, and never will matter, we tend to isolate, withhold, and withdraw from life. The terminal withdrawal response to feeling insignificant has been rebranded by organizations as turnover. Right? That is usually an inevitable withdrawal response of not feeling seen, heard, affirmed, or needed.
Right.
Really, at its
cog
core.
in the wheel. Yeah.
Cog in the wheel. The cog in the wheel is another one, right?
Yeah.
It goes back to dispensability. Max Ringelmann, the French engineer, 1913, had individuals pull on a rope, had groups pull on a rope as hard as they could. He attached it to a dynamometer that measures force. And he wanted to know which groups, when he added up the force readings, would exert more force, with the individuals or the groups. And the individuals did every time. Why is that? Because they felt their effort and they were not dispensable. Feeling needed. It's called the Ringelmann effect. Feeling needed is an essential ingredient of feeling like you matter. And so as we think about these topics and we think about how to weave them into the workplace, we also know things like acts of desperation are screams for attention. Gossip, for example, the number one predictor there's two predictors of gossip in the research at work, as an example. Psychological contract violation. So my fair treatment as a human being with you has been violated. So I'm going to find somebody that will respect me and build a relationship with them. I will create attachment through gossip if I don't get it from the organization, or abusive supervision. Those are the two most significant predictors of workplace gossip. Complaining, blaming, protesting are all language of the unseen and the unheard. Anti-mattering, as Psychologist Gordon Fleck calls it. So a lot of the issues that I see in organizations in my practice, I find there are very few difficult people, but often there are a lot of people who feel unseen, unheard, undervalued, and are acting out in ways to secure the attention and validation they're not getting in their environments.
So there's so many different directions we can take this, but I want to ask something that just pops into my head because in some cases we've done somewhat similar work, right, in different contexts, and inevitably I think what you have to raise to be at least to be nuanced about this is in any of these situations, workplace situations where there's call it what you want, burnout, turnover, poor leadership, all those sorts of things. A lot of times it's let's call it top-down policies or structures or cultural issues. And I would argue, but I want to tell me if I'm wrong, right? Or how you think about this, the individual and mindset and perception and attitude and cognitive behavioral techniques and emotion, like all those things, I think also play a really significant role, right? But I mean, it sounds like you agree, but tell me how you think about that dynamic and that balance when you're working with an organization.
100%, right? And burnout, when you think about protective resources against burnout or protective resources that serve the experience of resilience, for example, or the demonstration of resilience. There are individual like positive outlook, for example, which I know, that's how it's termed in the resilience literature. Positive outlook is one of the most important predictors of resilience, right? Being able to choose a response to a situation that is positive and productive while acknowledging the situation could suck and be really difficult. That's the opposite. The toxic positivity is everything is great. Right. That's not what we're talking about. We talk about positive outlook in the research on resilience. So yes, definitely there are things that individuals can do to build a mindset that helps to boost their own resources for resilience. However, a well individual in an unwell system eventually becomes an unwell individual.
Sure.
Right. It's the principle of toxicity. I could take an organism out of a toxic environment, rehabilitate them, give them everything that they need, and throw them back into a toxic environment, and they will eventually become a toxic organism. So, but what I think we need to do is I think we've put too much onus on the individual. Right. Okay. So I was recently asked a couple weeks ago to do a session on mattering with healthcare workers, this big healthcare company. And I said, well, what have you been doing up to this point in leadership development? And we've been focusing on helping people fill their cup first. Right? We've been focusing people on put themselves first, self-care, all of these tactics. But they were coming to me because their culture was deteriorating. It's no surprise that if your leadership development burnout strategy has been to help individuals cope themselves, coping strategies, without enabling people to have the interpersonal skills to cultivate an environment of social support in which people feel seen, heard, valued, and needed so that they can act compassionately to one another, that your culture is crumbling as you're spending more time having people do self-care. I think there needs to be a balance, right? There needs to be a balance. We have to, at the same time, cultivate environments that help people feel seen, heard, valued, and needed. And so others can act compassionately to them at the same time as we're equipping people with the individual skills. Because I worry that a lot of the wellness programs and the individual flourishing programs are actually coping programs.
They can be, certainly.
Here's how to cope with a system that's heaping feelings of insignificance on you or making you feel insignificant. And that only goes
pizza parties and yoga classes, right?
So I think that now is the time, like, imagine true flourishing and well-being programs that equip individuals with these awesome and essential skills, evidence-based skills. And at the same time, we're equipping leaders and the people around them to cultivate an environment that makes using those skills possible.
Sure.
And I think that's the next step in the workplace flourishing work that needs to be done, a more systems perspective. But that's a great point. Yes, individuals have onus, they have locus of control over their experience and their reactions and responses. But I think environments can make it easier for people to flourish.
Oh, yeah.
So how can you put a kind of degree on this in terms of how much a person needs to feel they matter to really feel the benefits in order to flourish, let's say. So you talk in a recent article, which we'll add to our show notes, that you discussed research in which people who are deemed essential workers have increasingly been asked whether they feel essential, right? Now, feeling essential, that's quite a high level of mattering, right? You can feel like you matter without feeling you're essential. So you could feel like you could be replaced, but nonetheless you
Well,
matter.
actually, the research indicates that it's very difficult to feel like you matter if you don't feel needed. So Gregory Elliott, social psychologist, I think he's at Brown now, but he, the research on mattering, the general mattering scale, the validated components of mattering are awareness. People pay attention to us. So we have to have people see us and acknowledge us. Importance, we have to feel like we are important to someone else. Someone's investing in us, our potential. And then we have to feel needed, relied on. It's called reliance, that others rely on us. In fact, when I ask people, we are doing a study now, an interview study, and when we ask people the first time in their life they felt like they mattered. This is a really powerful question just for listeners in general. I mean, think about the first time in your life when you first felt like you mattered as a human being. Almost everybody in our sample has included one example of when they felt a parent needed them to do something, when they were called on in a crisis, when they became a caretaker, when they became a parent, when they became a partner, when someone else relied on them. That if they didn't show up, that something wouldn't happen. And so I would argue that feeling essential and feeling needed, just like the Ringelmann effect shows, feeling essential, feeling indispensable, irreplaceable. Business leaders don't like when I say that. Feeling irreplaceable is essential to experiencing mattering.
Right. Wow.
Hi, friends. Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Anti-Fragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Anti-Fragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com. Well, that was going to be my question, because you said need, and I wonder if we were using need and like irreplaceable pretty synonymously, and it sounds like we are, which is interesting to me because and maybe this is, I don't know, maybe this is too like kind of outside of the head or too like cognitive and not emotional enough, but like like in past positions, I've never been in a place where I felt irreplaceable, but I did feel like I would describe what I felt as mattering. But not
So there's a difference
irreplaceability.
between there's a difference between having like your skills and what you do in your job. Like a job could be replaced. Like someone who just does a job. That's only if you're viewing that person as just a resource to get stuff done.
The collection of skills.
But like you, Nick,
Yeah.
your personality, your unique strengths, the unique impact you make in the conversations around you, how you make people feel in nuanced ways when you're in that environment, I don't believe is replaceable. So what we mean by feeling needed is not codependence either. So it's not like making you feel guilty for not showing up or making you feel like I couldn't function without you, John. You know, that would be developing a codependent relationship. That's actually dangerous. We're not talking about that. What I'm talking about is that your strengths, your unique self, your unique life, your unique personality, that you feel that you are not dispensable and what you're doing is not disposable. But many
Got it.
leaders, for example, I worked with a manufacturing company that was having labor issues, their labor recruitment issues, a frontline manufacturing center in the auto parts industry. And the first thing I asked him was, "Oh, tell me about your like socialization, your onboarding program." And he said, "What onboarding program? We're just trying to get warm bodies in here." So there's this thing called the Pygmalion effect. How you see people
Yep.
is how you treat people. How you treat them is who they become.
Sure.
If you see someone as a warm body, just a resource, you will treat them as such. You won't have an onboarding program.
Hmm.
If you'll treat them as a replaceable resource. Now, the problem is that when people feel replaceable, they tend to act replaceable. When people feel irreplaceable, they tend to act irreplaceable. So, like Nick, if I were to ask you to go to a dinner party at my house tomorrow night, and I were like, "Hey, Nick, I'm having this dinner party tomorrow night. I want you to come," and you're like, "Yeah, I'll go." But then you wake up tomorrow morning and you're like, really don't want to go to that dinner party. How easy is it for you to get out of the dinner party? Pretty emotionally easy, right? But if I said, "Hey, Nick, I need you to bring dessert, that great dessert you make to my dinner party tomorrow night. Will you come?" Nick says, "Yeah, I'll go." Nick gets up the next morning and says, "I really don't want to go to that dinner party, but Zach needs me to bring that great dessert I make." Right? That's the power of feeling needed. How easy is it for you to get out of that and just say, "I'm not going to go"? It's hard, right? So these are things like commitment and engagement in organizations, I think, are virtually impossible if people don't feel like they and their unique gifts and their unique strengths and the uniqueness they bring to a job are replaceable. How can we expect someone who feels replaceable or has been told they're replaceable to act irreplaceable?
So I'm curious to hear how, because you brought up manufacturing, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how that conversation goes and how you tackle that. Because, there's so many different types of work, and it's probably fair to say, as like a learning specialist, right? And somebody with a degree in this, that some things structurally are easier to learn than others, which thereby may make those things or those jobs easier to replace, right?
Yeah,
And
and easier to dehumanize.
100%, right? And so how does a thoughtful, effective leader that doesn't want to get on the wrong side of that potentially really thin line go about that, right? Kind of looking at the reality is, could I find another human to maybe do this thing? But how do I know that, but I also know Pygmalion, and I don't ever want them to feel that. I want them to know how valued they are. How does one balance those sort of like sensibilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is taking some space to actually reflect on how you actually see a person and who you want them to become. How do you see this person? And you have to be honest with yourself. If, one of the in that company, one of the frontline managers that we work with, I do a lot of work. My dissertation was with janitors, university custodians. We spent a year and a half with this small group of janitors, coming to understand how cleaners came to understand purpose and meaningfulness in their work.
Yeah.
And one of the things that came out of that I'm able to name now that I wasn't is that they experienced very small moments of mattering. They experienced very small moments with a supervisor or a building user in which they were seen, heard, valued, and needed. One of the people in our study said, "Don't give me a free sandwich don't give me a free sandwich or a certificate. Remember my name and say thank you." It's one of the
Yeah.
best quotes I've ever
That's
gotten in
awesome.
an
Yeah.
interview study. So what does this do? So what this does is it allows us as leaders to think, do I really see this person as a person living a life as complex and as important and as vivid as my own? Or do I see this person as a means to my end?
Mm.
Because the categorical imperative, Kant's categorical imperative, if you're philosophy guys, is that when we see people as a means to an end, they cease to become people. They become tools for us. And I think many leaders unintentionally, and they won't tell you this, see people as means to an end. So it makes it easier to dehumanize them. So how do you see this person really? But then think, who do you want them to become? So an example is I got to work with a frontline manager, and he said, "Yeah, I have this one woman. She's always calling out sick and always lying about it." right? And so he was having absentee issues. So I said, well, what do you do? How do you treat her? Well, she goes, well, when she comes in, I make sure that she knows she's going to get this many attendance points, and that if this happens again, she's not going to be here for much longer. I go, how's that been working? And he tells me, like, it hasn't been working. And why is that, right? When somebody feels like an issue, they will act like an issue. So all we did is I said, hey, next time she's absent, I want you to ask her what's going on in her life. What makes it so easy for her not to want to be here? Ask her that question.
Mm-hmm.
And he did, and it was uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And he found out that she was a caretaker for an elderly parent, and which is very unpredictable. And she had to run around and often just called out. So he said, well, we can do something to help with that. Let's talk about your schedule more, right? All of a sudden, this amazing thing happens where a human feels seen and heard, right? They feel seen by somebody. And slowly but surely, his issues with her, absenteeism, have been improved because he sought understanding before he sought evaluation. So one thing, like as a leader, that you can do immediately is to optimize the next interaction you have and truly seek understanding before you evaluate.
Mm-hmm.
Notice people, come to see people, come to understand people, affirm them and their gifts. One of the things he told me after is he said, I tried to think of one thing I miss about her when she's not here. Because I asked him to think about one thing you miss about her. And he said, well, I guess she tells a lot of jokes that get her other line workers laughing. And I said, tell her that. Say, I really missed last shift. We missed the smiles that you put on your teammates' faces. I missed that.
Yeah.
Again, it's
So
relearning these basic human skills.
Yeah, that's the
absolutely.
quote unquote dessert you bring to the dinner party.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
this is probably a record episode in terms of the number of other references to other episodes we've had coming up. Because so I didn't know you did your PhD research on that. We had one of our first episodes, Emily Esfahani Smith, who talked about studies of janitors in hospitals, and a study in particular by Amy Rzezinski about how hospital cleaners viewed their work. And that was in the context of meaning rather than mattering, but you can see how the same point functions here, right? The idea there was that she looked at how hospital cleaners saw, some of the ones that she looked at in her research, saw their role as helping sick people get better, or helping sick people to heal, helping to heal patients as part of the overall mission of a hospital. I assume that's part of this picture as well, right? It's creating a narrative where you, as it were, reframe the way you're looking at your role. And it's quite straightforward to do that in the case of, say, a janitor in a hospital. That one way you can look at it is you're just picking up rubbish. Another way is you're helping sick people get better, because they are necessary for the functioning of the hospital. For people to get better, they have to be in a clean, extremely clean environment, right?
And they believed that they were necessary. So they believed it. One of the janitors in our study said, I said, what's the most meaningful part of your job? She told me it was cleaning the bathrooms in a university dormitory where students stay on Monday mornings, because she has to do that right when she comes in. I was a PhD student at the time, and I was like, that sounds disgusting. So I totally broke researcher protocol. And I was like, that sounds gross. And she goes, it is. It's the worst part of my job. But because it's the worst part of my job, I say to myself every time I go into that bathroom that I'm cleaning this bathroom so that these kids don't get sick. And I've since come to coin that a so that mentality, right? She had a so that mentality. But here's the thing, and this is what a lot of the work on mattering has helped me realize, is that we've actually approached meaningfulness as it's up to you to craft it. So job crafting, Amy Wierzbowski's work, very powerful. And it works. There's a lot of evidence behind it. But what we haven't looked at is, how do those people develop that cognitive perspective? Well, in some of our research, what we find is they have regular experiences where people have shown them the evidence of their significance, so they come to believe it. Right? So this is where I think this whole episode comes together, where you have the individual having the perspective to believe that my work matters as a janitor. But like that janitor I just told you about, in her first couple of weeks on the job, she said she would have liked to have been anywhere else in her life. She said she just got the job to put food on the table and to get a paycheck, and that's it. She needed to feed her two young sons. And she said a supervisor noticed that she was really struggling and brought her into a training room and showed her a dictionary and had her read the definition of the word custodian as a person responsible for a building and everyone in it. And she told me that that moment was one of the first times in her life that someone showed her she was worthy of responsibility. And I thought that was really sophisticated of that supervisor to like actually show her like objective evidence. Like, I'm not just saying this, your job exists for these other people. And so these moments of mattering help sustain that belief that allows us to cognitively craft our work as meaningful. So
Hmm.
I'm really interested now in taking an ecosystems view of meaningful work, which involves creating environments and enacting the interpersonal skills to make sure people have those moments of mattering that rejogs their memory. One of the most common words that people use in our interviews is that moment I actually felt like I mattered.
Hmm.
Actually. What is, and you'll hear this a lot now. If you ask this question, when's the time you felt like you mattered? Oh, I actually saw that I made a difference. That goes to show how powerful that reflected appraisal is. To say, wait, Nick, wait, John, you do matter, right? That supervisor gave her the evidence of her significance, which allowed her to cognitively craft her job as meaningful.
Hmm. So, okay, so far we have a couple of clear practical strategies. The first is to give someone a role, for example, where an important role or a role where they're needed. So, for example, at the dinner party, you're not just invited to the dinner party, you're in charge of the dessert, and you could apply that to various areas, right? Another would be job crafting, um, focusing on the areas of, say, your work where you really do matter. You also do have a framework, though, right?
Mm-hmm.
Three-part framework into how you make daily interactions with people more meaningful to increase mattering in the workplace, but perhaps also in other parts of your life, like your social life, noticing how to truly see and hear people, affirming how to show people they're significant, and needing how to show people they're needed. So I imagine you've talked about a fair bit of this already, but do you want to just go into that in a bit more detail, that framework?
Yeah. And again, just like most of the work in translating psychological science to practice, this was all been validated, right? So Gregory Elliott's work on awareness, importance, and reliance. What the work had done so far on mattering is that it had helped describe what the experience of mattering was like. What we wanted to do is describe what other people were doing when you experienced that experience. So we wanted to look at practices and skills that others have when those experiences that of awareness, importance, and reliance exist. And the three areas where people notice us, they truly see and hear us, they affirm us, they show us the difference that we make and how we make it, and they show us how we're needed, how we're relied on. So noticing is paying attention to the ebbs and flows and details of someone's life and their voice and showing them that you've thought about them. It's things
Mm-hmm.
like remembering people, checking in on people, checking in on how people are doing. I know Nick brought up burnout in hospitals. There's a great study that was done at the Rotterdam Eye Hospital where, and it was published in Harvard Business Review, where researchers split a group of nurses and clinical teams into two groups. In one group, they had them do a simple red, yellow, green check in. So red means you're really stressed out, you're offline, you're burned out, it's hard to be present. Yellow means you can be present, but you got some things pulling at your attention. And green means you're in flow. You're here, you're passionate, you're present. And so they had them do that at their daily huddles for a few months. So daily huddles in healthcare usually go something like this. Here's what's clinically wrong in every room. Go have a great day, right? Not very empowering. They measured patient satisfaction, engagement, and burnout. The group that did this check-in, the red, yellow, green check-in, for about 15 seconds at the beginning of these huddles, indicated higher patient satisfaction in their units, lower burnout, and lower engagement, and higher engagement. Why? Well, one of the reasons why is that the people who experienced that said simply they were having better conversations in their break room. So noticing, like checking in on how the people were doing was a key mitigator of burnout. And Maslow finds this very clearly that social support is one of the most powerful mitigators of burnout. I mentioned that because that green, yellow, red check in practice is a practice of noticing somebody, right? It's a practice of seeing the data that is their energy and emotions. The second one we've talked a lot about is affirming people. There's a difference between affirmation and appreciation and recognition. That's, I think, important for listeners. Appreciation is showing gratitude for who someone is. Hey, I'm glad, Nick, that you're on this call. Recognition is showing gratitude for what someone does. Nick, you're really good at fostering a podcast conversation and asking questions. Look at Nick, everybody. But then affirmation is showing someone how their specific, unique strengths make a specific, unique difference. So it's saying, hey, Nick, the question that you asked about midway through here to dig into a concept further was really helpful in pushing this conversation along. And I think if just one listener listens to this who could make someone else feel like they matter and they do that, that's because of you. So thank you. Right. That's much different. It's an interpersonal skill to give meaningful gratitude in that way. And then I think we talked about feeling needed a lot. I think there are 5 powerful words that someone could use right now with somebody in their next interaction, and you'll see the power of mattering, which is if you say, if it wasn't for you. Hey, if it wasn't for you, this wouldn't be possible in my life. Think about someone you rely on and say, if it wasn't for you, and just watch what happens. Other ways to do that is when you're missing people when they're gone. So often we have a meeting and someone was absent, maybe they're on vacation, and when they come back, we're like, hey, hope you had a good vacation. Instead, take a minute and say to them, hey, I'm glad you had a great vacation, but I really missed your ability to think creatively on the spot in this meeting. I took down some notes I want you to take a look at. Makes you feel needed. We see this actually with people who are going on maternity leave in some of the studies where it's so easy, a lot of women report, for their bosses or supervisors or people just to say, oh, yeah, great. You went on maternity leave for 3 months and you came back and everything was fine. And that actually has caused a lot of people to experience self-doubt about their identity and how much they were needed because they didn't feel missed. That's, again, mattering in disguise, anti-mattering. So show people you miss them. And people are listening to this probably like, Zach, this is common sense. Why do you have a job?
Do you and Karen Rivich know each other? You ever
No.
interacted with Karen? So Karen's the director of resilience training for the UPenn Pause Psych Center. So she's worked closely with, you mentioned Marty, for a long, long time. And when I was working at a school, which is a whole nother conversation, because everything you're saying, this entire conversation, I've been thinking, like, yeah, I get it. This is happening at work, but man, is it a real problem for young people in schools? That whole cog in the wheel, just push them through sort of thing. But that's maybe a different conversation or a different episode. So anyway, I was working at a school, had Karen out to do some work with a leadership team. We're sitting there kind of having lunch, and she basically refers to positive psychology, which was had been growing pretty considerably at that time. This is quite a few years ago. And she just kind of described it as science that's catching up to grandma. Right. And that's why I wondered if you know each other, because that always stuck with me. It's just like, oh yeah, it's stuff that we hear all the time, or to your point, that sounds like common sense, kind of gives you that duh feeling. But the science now, or at least the empiricism, seems to be, just putting more validity behind. So anyway, I thought that'd be a useful phrase.
Love that. I love that phrase. And it's common sense, but it's not common practice. Right.
Yes.
And I think that when it comes to leadership, especially, and when it comes to being a good human to other humans, we've tend to have relied on intuition for so long. Like, we'll promote this person. This person's a teacher, so they just know how to make people feel like they matter. But intuition doesn't scale. Like, practices and skills and habits scale. And so one of the things I think that's happened is that as we've called these essential things soft, and we talked about this at the beginning, one of the biggest problems with calling these skills soft is that we've cognitively downplayed them. So when we think something simple as human beings, we have an overconfidence bias and we approach it with less rigor. So when we label something as soft, we approach it with less rigor. We don't hone the skills enough. And then you see where we're at today, where 60% of people feel lonely, 47% of people feel forgotten. WorkHuman did a study where 30% of people self-reported on a self-report questionnaire that they felt, quote unquote, invisible at work. You
Wow.
want to talk about education? Education Week did a study of over 66,000 students from 6th grade through 12th grade. They asked them, do you think anyone would notice if you were absent? Over half of that sample said no. So if this were common sense, that those data points would not be the case.
Right.
And one of the things, like, and I know this was one of the questions we were going to discuss of how we got here, but one of the data points people keep pointing to is loneliness, 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 loneliness. And what's happened is that our knee-jerk reaction to loneliness has been to connect more. Let's connect more. So Slack usage at work, for example, went from 12 million to 32 million users a year in about 3 years. We have tripled our time spent in meetings because we thought we should connect more. Engagements outside of work or social engagements that have been put on people have increased forever, and we're stretching people thin. But then you look at longitudinal studies on being alone and loneliness is not well correlated with being alone.
Correct. The really important point.
Yeah.
Loneliness is correlating with not feeling like you matter to the people around you.
Correct.
Mhm.
Not being seen.
So a lot of the books on loneliness have focused on let's re-engineer our communities and organizations to connect more. But I think they got it wrong on a big level. I think we need to reskill individuals to ensure the person in front of us feels seen, heard, valued, and needed. The opposite of loneliness is not having more people around you. The opposite of loneliness is feeling like you matter to the people around you, whether you're at a coffee shop, whether it's with your delivery driver, whether it's with your family member, you made coffee for someone and they thank you for it, whether it's at the office. And I think that's a big point. The big longitudinal studies and reviews on loneliness find that feeling seen, feeling heard, feeling valued, being in quality relationships, or in Jane Dutton's work, high quality connections,
Sure.
are the most important way to mitigate loneliness. But what do we have to do? We have to reskill in an environment where we've been communicating digitally and we've gotten to communicate in short statements with one another. And our skill to truly see, hear, value, and need others underneath our own eyes has withered. Right? If John gives me bad news, I can put a sad emoji in a text and say, I'm sorry to hear that. I don't have to sit with John anymore.
Yeah.
Say, hey, how are you feeling? What's going on? If Nick, you give me good news, I can just say, thumbs up, great. I don't have to have the skill to sit with you and say, hey, I've really noticed how hard you've been working on this. I've noticed that you've had the strength of perseverance. And I've seen the difference that you make, and I'm really proud of you, and I'm not surprised that this has happened to you. That's a skill.
Right.
And so maybe, Zach, you've actually just answered brilliantly there with that wonderful answer. What was going to be our final question? But I mean, I'll at least ask if you want to elaborate any further on that. We have this signature final question we call the flourishing question. What is the one lesson on flourishing you want our listeners to walk away with? And what's a practical step putting it into action? It sounds like that one step is to reskill in making other people feel like they matter.
I would say think about the next interaction you have or are going to have after you listen to this podcast. And think about what you are going to do to make sure that person feels seen, heard, valued by you, and needed by you. It could be as simple as saying, hey, I noticed today, this morning, that you weren't as talkative as usual. I wanted to check in on that, make sure you're okay. It could be as simple as saying, hey, you make me coffee every morning and I listen to this podcast. You can blame it on me, by the way, if this is uncomfortable for you. I listen to this podcast and I just wanted to say that, it's a small thing, but it really makes my day better. Or saying to someone, hey, to your delivery driver, hey, you've come here often. I've been in a rush. I wanted to get your name. Do you have a family? Do you have friends? What do you do here? What do you like to do in our community? Man, if you just do these things, these
The
small
name
things.
thing's so big, so easy too.
If you just do these small things, I would argue that you are helping someone else flourish in their life in more ways than you could ever imagine, in more ways than you could do by reading 1,000 books on the topic. And I write books on the topic, so. But I think we need to become interested in one another again, and build ecosystems that enable flourishing. And we can do it. That's what's so great about this. This is not a new program. You don't have to buy anything from me. You don't have to install a culture operating system in your organization. You can simply optimize the next interaction you have.
Love that.
Love it. It's great.
Thank you so much.
That said, if people do want to buy stuff from you, where can they find more and interact with you?
You can go to
Mercurio.
zachmercurio.com. So what we did actually is we created this new mattering. So we have there's two areas of interest for me, three, but people get confused with terms. So we have this purpose hub on the page. It's around meaningful work and purpose. And pretty much all of the exercises that I use are available to download. You don't even need to give me your email address. And then we have a mattering page as well. All the resources I use with Leader are there to download. You just download them and use them. There's templates on how to give meaningful gratitude, how to use an if it wasn't for you statement, how to reflect on moments when you've mattered. There's a self-assessment you can take that we're in the process of validating. So go on there and just dig around and see if something's useful to you. And then the other thing is that I do have that new book coming out, The Power of Mattering. If you're really into this and trying to, if you heard something today and you think I want to be a part of this, I encourage you to get in touch with us.
Cool.
There's a way to sign up for email updates there.
Cool. Great. Sounds like a lot of zero cost resources, a lot of different things you can get into. We'll put all of that stuff in our show notes, as we've, said, but we'll say one more time, huge supporter of your work and these ideas and these concepts. And anyone that's been listening to a lot of our episodes has heard time and time again, like the two biggest predictors of flourishing are meaning and like connection. And those two are often really deeply kind of interconnected, right? And I think you touched on so much of that today. And I think your work in general touches on it consistently and does so at a high level. So I hope people check out your stuff. So glad we were able to spend some time with you and get to learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you all. This was fun.
Thank you, Zach.
Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long form blog, and every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.